Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. For more information, or if you would like to contact me, send your emails to rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com. Hello, my name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. Although my mother was born in Glasgow, her heritage is of Clan Grant, a Highland clan. Clan Grant were also represented at the historic meeting of the Highland clan chiefs back in 1691, where they were asked to swear allegiance to William of Orange and his Queen Mary, which I'll tell you about soon. The Massacre of Glencoe took place on the 13th of February 1692, and it happened during the beginning of what was known as the Jacobite era in Scotland, which spanned from about 1688 to 1746, and was marked by a series of uprisings and rebellions aimed at restoring the Stuart monarchy to the British throne. The Jacobites, just in case you're not familiar with them, were named after James II of England, who weirdly was James VII of Scotland, and sought to reinstate him and his descendants after his deposition in the Revolution of 1688. This period saw significant battles such as the Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689, the Battle of Sheriff Muir in 1715, and the most famous of them all, the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the latter being a decisive defeat for the Jacobites. This era also profoundly influenced Scottish culture, politics, and identity for the next 500 years, ultimately leading to the integration of Scotland into the United Kingdom and a very significant socio-political change in the Highlands called the Clearances. So I'm just going to kick straight off with the Massacre of Glencoe. King James Stuart was a Catholic man. However, Protestantism was the main religion of the time since the Reformation led by John Knox and Oliver Cromwell in the late 16th century. King James had a son, and he declared that he would be brought up a Catholic. The Scottish people didn't want that. They wanted a Protestant monarchy. To give you a modern perspective, even when my mum was a girl, the feeling between Catholics and Protestants in Scotland, like Ireland, ran very deep. Celtic United is a Catholic football team. Rangers United is a Protestant one. And she was actually told by her mother, my granny, when she was just 16, that the absolute worst thing that she could do in the world is bring home a Catholic boy. I'm not sure that anything has actually changed. Mary Stuart was actually the sister of James VII, and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, were invited to invade Britain on the 30th of June, 1688. They arrived on the 5th of November, 1688. James had a large but beleaguered army. However, he refused to fight, the coward that he was, and he fled London. As he fled, he threw the Great Seal of the realm into the River Thames and made for the coast to flee to France. He was, however, caught and imprisoned. William of Orange, however, didn't want James to be considered a martyr, so James was allowed to escape to France and was offered a palace by his cousin and ally, King Louis XIV. A parliament was then called in London, and James was deemed to have abdicated. And therefore his sister Mary and his brother-in-law William were named the new monarchs of Britain. They became Mary II and William III. A new Bill of Rights was then passed that now stated that a Catholic would never again take the throne of Britain, neither shall a British monarch ever marry a Catholic. However, James had huge support of the Highland clans, some more fiercely dedicated to James than others, and they were willing to fight for their king, to have him restored onto the throne with the help of France. The Earl of Breadalbane, Slippery John Campbell, known for switching sides instantly, showed allegiance to Mary II and William III by trying to convince the Highland clans to pledge their allegiance to William and Mary. However, there was a caveat, isn't there always? There was an element of bribery involved. Each Highland clan would receive a share of £12,000, which equates to roughly £3 million in today's money. So they would all receive a share of a £12,000 pot for their agreement to sign the oath to William and Mary. That meeting took place on the 30th of June 1691 at Achaldor Castle, just south of Glencoe. Present at that meeting were Sir John MacLean of the MacLean clan, Sir Ewan Cameron of Lochiel of the Cameron clan, Archibald Campbell of the Campbell clan, and John Grant of the Grant clan. Last but not least, MacDonald of Glengarry of the MacDonald clan. Look, the relationships between the Scottish clans during the late 17th century were extremely complex and often fraught with tension. And while the meeting on the 30th of June 1691 brought together several prominent clan chiefs, it didn't necessarily indicate that there was going to be any future harmonious relationships among them. The MacLeans and the Campbell clans had a long history of rivalry and conflict. The Campbells, one of the most powerful clans, if not the most powerful, often found themselves in opposition to the MacLeans. Disputes over land and power were common sources of conflict. To give you a bit more colour, the Camerons, led by Sir Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, also had a contentious relationship with the Campbells. The Campbells' support for the government and their expansionist ambitions, frequently clashed with the interests of the Cameron clan. The MacDonalds, on the other hand, particularly the branch led by the MacDonalds of Glengarry, had a history of enmity with the Campbells. The feud between the MacDonalds and the Campbells was one of the most famous and long-standing rivalries in Scottish history. The clan Grant, on the other hand, under John Grant, one of my ancestors, had relatively fewer direct conflicts with the other clans compared to the intense rivalries involving the Campbells. However, they were still involved in the broader political and territorial disputes of the period. The MacDonalds themselves had actually fallen on hard times in recent years. They were previously the Lords of the Isles, the descendants of Somerled, but they had lost everything and had now resulted to cattle rustling to make ends meet. Of course, they weren't the only clan doing this. The MacGregors, for example, were another. And most of the cattle in that area, the cattle that they were rustling, of course, belonged to the Campbells. So, of course, the Campbells were not the best of friends with the MacDonalds. Now, to confuse matters even more, Alistair MacLean was also related to the Campbells by marriage. The Earl of Breadalbane, John Campbell, reminded MacLean at this meeting that he actually owed the Campbells money for the stolen cattle. So MacLean's share of the £12,000 pot was gone instantly. However, the Earl of Breadalbane also promised the clans that if James VII was ever to return to Scotland from France to fight, then the oath to William and Mary would be torn up and their support would revert to James's side. But the chiefs in their wisdom decided to seek permission from James VII first. They wrote a letter to him in France. They didn't want to face trouble from either James or William's side. The deadline for signing the oath to William and Mary was set as the 31st December 1691. The clan chiefs held out on signing anything until they had heard from James, because for the backing of the French, James would surely return to fight and be returned to the throne. Meanwhile, James was partying in Paris and had little time for the clans or their letters, but he eventually sent a letter back on the 12th of December 1691 advising the clans to sign the oath to William and Mary, as no French backing would come before the turn of the year. The Secretary of State for Scotland at this time was a man called John Dalrymple. John Dalrymple had worked for James, but defected immediately to William and Mary on James's abdication. So John Dalrymple really disliked the Highland clans, with himself being from the lowlands. But James's letter and response sent from France was intercepted in London, and at the request of Dalrymple, the letter was kept for a few days before being resealed and then very slowly carried north to Scotland. 10 days before the deadline, the letter had only just reached Edinburgh, quite a distance short of its Highland destinations. Some clan chiefs, when they received the letter, even withheld it for a short time from neighboring clans as a way of potentially embarrassing their rivals, because William had said that if the clans did not sign the oath to them, there would be serious repercussions. One clan's loss could be another clan's gain. The word finally reached Alistair MacLean, the chief of Glencoe, on the 30th of December. He had 1 day to get to the village of Inverary, but it was too late. He would never make it to Inverary. It was too far. Instead, he headed over the hills down to Inverlochy, which most people now know as Fort William, where on the 31st of December he met with the governor, a Colonel John Hill. Unfortunately, there was not much that Colonel Hill could do for him, but what he did do was decide to write him a letter stating that MacLean had presented himself to sign the oath on the 31st of December. And he was satisfied of this, and when MacLean arrives in Inverary, Sir John Campbell should receive MacLean's signature in good faith. And the signature should be dated as of the 31st December 1691 to say that MacLean had signed the oath before the deadline. MacLean leaves Fort William. At this time of year, it's midwinter, so it's dark, it's snowing, it's damp, it's miserably cold. The conditions are horrendous, and he's not a young man. Frankly, anyone out walking in these conditions would have to be super fit and rugged up in Arctic gear to survive. So imagine the weight of what he is wearing, the bolts of cloth that he would have had to have secured to keep himself warm. And he would have been weighted down with multiple layers of heavy clothing. He would also be carrying food and perhaps water. 2 days later, he arrives in Inverary on January the 2nd. However, Sir Colin Campbell, the man he's supposed to meet, isn't there. He had left on the eve of the 31st of December from Inverary to celebrate Hogmanay, which is essentially a party that starts on the 31st of December and finishes roughly on the 6th of January. So Colin Campbell's away. He's celebrating, and he doesn't return until the 6th of January. When he returns, MacLean marches straight up to him and demands that he signs the oath. The oath was signed as per the agreement with Colin John Hill, and the paperwork was sent on to Edinburgh to the Privy Council to agree it. John Hill then followed this up by sending MacLean another letter stating that the MacDonald's of Glencoe were now under the protection of the garrison at Fort William. In Edinburgh, however, the Privy Council, despite the evidence proving otherwise, along with pressure from Dalrymple, MacIan's signature was found to be illegal, a late submission, and was struck from the record. 5 days after MacLean had signed the oath, Dalrymple found out that MacLean's name had been struck off, and he was absolutely delighted. He now had a clan to make an example of. Now, this is interesting because there were a number of other clans who had also not signed the oath, mostly due to the abhorrent weather. But Dalrymple, for some reason, hated the MacDonalds more than the rest, and he was glad of this information. Dalrymple wrote many letters forcing William III to act, and despite Colonel Hill's efforts to call for a reprieve for the MacDonalds, Dalrymple ordered Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, a 60-year-old unsuccessful military man, perhaps because he was a heavy drinker and a gambler, but he ordered Captain Robert Campbell to advance with 120 soldiers into Glencoe to stay with the MacDonalds for a number of days and to await further instructions. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Altodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Campbell and his 120 heavily armed soldiers arrived at Glencoe on the 2nd of February 1692, telling MacIan that they were just passing through whilst collecting taxes. To MacLean, this was plausible, and he had no reason to suspect anything untoward. Added to the story that MacIan and Captain Robert Campbell were related by marriage. This also seemed to be a reconciliation between the two clans. The soldiers stayed with the MacDonalds for 12 days under Highland hospitality. They were fed, they were watered. And the idea of Highland hospitality is actually not a law, it's an unwritten agreement. It basically means that if you were to invite a stranger into your house and to break bread with them, then they become a trusted friend. They were no longer to be considered a stranger. So the soldiers stayed with the MacDonalds for 12 days, and on the 12th of February, Campbell of Glenlyon received his instructions from Dalrymple. I'm now going to read the transcript of the order that Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon received. You are hereby ordered to fall upon the rebels, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, and put all to the sword under 70. You are to have a special care about the old fox and his sons. Do upon no account escape your hands. You are to secure all the avenues that no man escape. This you are to put in execution at 5 of the clock precisely, and by that time, or very shortly after it, I'll strive to be at you with a stronger party. If I do not come to you at 5, you are not to tarry for me, but to fall on. This is by the king's special command, for the good and safety of the country, that these miscreants be cut off root and branch. See that this be put in execution without feud or favor, else you may expect to be dealt with as one not true to king nor government, nor a man fit to carry commission in the king's service. Expecting you will not fail in the fulfilling hereof, as you love yourself, I subscribe these with my hand at Balochas, February the 12th, 1692, for their Majesty's service, R. Duncanson to Captain Campbell. So the orders are actually plain and very simple. You can't misconstrue what they're telling him to do. At 5 a.m. the following day on the 13th of February, 1692, Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon and his 120 men were to kill every member of the MacDonald clan under the age of 70 years old, men, women, and children. And it was the following morning at 5 a.m. on the Button, on the 13th of February, 1692, amongst a snow blizzard in the dead of the night, that Captain Robert Campbell and his army of 120 men carried out their orders. MacLean was shot twice in his bedroom by Robert Campbell whilst getting dressed to see what all the commotion was about. MacIan's 2 sons were, however, able to flee. Officially, the toll of the massacre that took place on that day claimed the lives of 38 men, women, and children. However, of the many to flee, some died of exposure from winter temperatures, and anywhere up to 300 MacDonald clanspeople died as a result of exposure. At the time, it is believed that about 1,000 people lived in the valley of Glencoe. So for only 38 to be killed directly at the massacre, it indicates that perhaps a lot of the soldiers refused to carry out their orders. By the time that night had fallen, the soldiers and everyone had disappeared. Any nearby survivors came out of hiding and down into the village to begin burying the dead. Alistair MacLean was buried on the MacDonald's burial island of Alamundi on Loch Leven, a short distance away from Glencoe. Dalrymple, on the other hand, was furious to find out that MacLean's 2 sons had survived, and he wrote many, many letters urging the survivors to be hunted and killed. However, no one responded to his calls. Campbell and his men were soon to be found in Edinburgh, in the drinking halls, talking about the massacre. And one night, a drunken Campbell lost the orders for the attack. They'd been stolen in a bar. The orders were taken immediately to France and published in the Paris Gazette. From there, the news spread like wildfire over Europe, and of course, back to Britain. The Earl of Breadalbane received news of it and was horrified that the orders had been leaked. He could clearly see that the Campbells were going to take the blame for the massacre, and he immediately wrote to the MacDonalds of Glencoe asking them to absolve himself and his clan from any responsibility for the massacre. Still to this day, the Campbells have received no response. King William at this point was fighting in Flanders and France, and due to the news, his wife, Queen Mary, began to ask questions of Parliament with regards to what had taken place. By the following year, in 1693, King William was forced into holding an official inquiry into the massacre. However, by the end of it, everyone, including the king, had been exonerated. No one was to blame. This was no one's fault. 2 years later, in 1695, the year following the death of Mary II, a second inquiry was held. But this time William would not be allowed to interfere. But once again, William was exonerated. Dalrymple, however, was sacked as Secretary of State, and the slippery Earl of Breadalbane was charged with treason, but later released. The worst off was Robert Campbell and his officers that had served with him on that day. They were charged with slaughter under trust, and they were to stand trial, but no such trial ever came to fruition. The MacDonalds moved back into Glencoe, and MacLean's oldest son, John, became the 13th chief of Glencoe, building his home on the site where his fathers had once stood. It's a tragic story, and of course, the final question was this a Klan event? Was it Campbell orchestrated? Are the events of the story that I told you actually true? After much research, I came to the conclusion that the story itself doesn't focus on Klan revenge. However, the details I gave you were absolutely true. But I think the Klan revenge side of it is a total misconception. The massacre was entirely planned in London and Edinburgh and was solely an operation of the British Army under the orders of William III and masterminded by the Secretary of State over Scotland and Lord Advocate John Dalrymple, Master of the Stair. In no way whatsoever can it truthfully be called a Klan event. The government troops in Glencoe had been blamed for turning upon their hosts and committing murder under trust. They definitely did that. However, the troops had not been invited into Clan MacDonald homes in Glencoe, but they were actually forcibly billeted upon them as punishment for the failure of Clan MacDonald to pay cess, property taxes. The only reason that Captain Campbell was in the army in the first place, and therefore there at all, was because he had recently been bankrupted and his family was destitute. And this is an interesting story. Captain Campbell said that he bore no ill will towards the MacDonalds of Glencoe, in spite of the fact that in 1689, on their return from the Battle of Dunkeld, the MacLeans of Glencoe, together with their Clan Donald cousins, the MacDonalds of Glengarry, looted Glenlyon, stole his livestock, and razed Campbell's last remaining holdings, increasing his financial problems. In his subsequent appeal for compensation, Campbell showed he clearly believed the Glengarry men to be the more culpable, making no mention of Glencoe in the appeal. While billeted at Glencoe, Captain Campbell visited the home of Alexander MacDonald, MacLean's youngest son, who was actually married to Campbell's niece and the sister of Rob Roy McGregor. Look, it's clearly a very complicated story, but the threats that were made against Robert Campbell of Glenlyon by his superiors in the orders delivered to him just a few hours before the killings, they were severe in the extreme. If he failed to order the killings, he would have been accused of treason himself, which was punishable by death. So those who try so hard to make out that the massacre was a Klan event, they're obliged to gloss over the fact that many of the MacDonalds escaped over the passes into Campbell lands, where they were secured by their kinsfolk there. Additionally, the government piper who played a well-known Campbell tune as a warning just before the massacre, they're seldom given credit for that either. So the piper plays before the attack starts. In fact, the massacre was so badly conducted that only 38 of the near 1,000 people that lived there were killed. And I think that's also a clear indication of the unwillingness of the Highlanders among the troops to actually kill their neighbors upon whom they had been billeted. I would also argue that the decline of fortunes on Clan MacDonald were in no way due to any lack of fighting spirit or strength on the part of their followers, nor to any overpowering use of strength in the field on the part of Clan Campbell. The Clan MacDonald weakness lay in the slowness in getting consistent allegiance to the King of Scots. However, on both sides, the Campbell-MacDonald relationship was one of love-hate, with many alliances and intermarriages actually taking place, as well as, the occasional conflicts. Through marriage, the early Campbell chiefs were also descendants of the Isles of Somerled. So, again, these are complex issues, but were they to blame? Was it a Klan event? I don't think so. The recent strong revival of interest in the Highland clans and the history among the Scottish descendants worldwide who are actually awakening, to this incredibly rich heritage, which has been missing for a long time, has actually produced, I think, many examples of the gentry of both Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald cooperating together to support Scottish events. And we've seen this in the ensuing 500 years. While there's some humorous kind of bantering that takes place whenever the Campbells and the MacDonalds get together, I think their respective histories are inevitable. Real knowledge is increasing, and the childish rancor of the few, mostly in Scotland, I have to say, seems more and more a mere indication of their failure to learn from the actual facts of history and of what took place. And much of the underlying feeling about the Campbells among members of the Clan MacDonald and the other clans stems not so much from the inequities of the killings or the misunderstandings of the events of Glencoe and the Jacobite leadership, but really from the fact that in the long view of history, when Clan MacDonald declined, it was Clan Campbell which strengthened and came to the fore. And usually in such situations, feelings can be twinged with jealousy and regret. People of Clan Campbell, I think, should be patient with their kinsmen, with the people of Clan MacDonald, for these feelings, and should thank Providence, I think, really, for providing them with an extraordinary line of chiefs. Until very recently, clan histories have tended to be highly partisan and biased. The late Colin MacDonald, Director of Education for Argyll, published The History of Argyll up to the beginning of the 16th century in 1951. His work was actually the first attempt, I think, to apply modern academic standards, unbiased bipartisan polemic, to the area in which many of the MacDonald-Campbell conflicts and allegiances took place. And I think he's often obliged to stress the unbalanced view of the earlier Clan MacDonald historians who, taking color from the latter events, reached back and ascribed a continual adversarial attitude between the two great clans when interpreting incidents earlier than the civil wars of the 17th century. And his analysis is actually refreshingly balanced. It's actually a very good read. I think just to finish on, many of the Irish Clan Donald invaded the Campbell lands in Argyll in 1645, and they actually are responsible for ravaging the country from end to end. But that was actually a part of a civil war which was national. The tragedy of Glencoe in 1692, I have no doubt in my mind it was a government massacre. Any who are inclined to disagree with that statement, you should study the 1986 history by Dr. Paul Hopkins of Cambridge University and his book Glencoe and the End of the Highland War. Folks, thanks for listening in. Bye for now.